My girlfriend's parents did not come to our wedding because they did not like my financial situation, but after 3 years they changed their mind and wanted to come back. The first time I met my girlfriend's parents, her dad looked me up and down and said, "So, what exactly do you do?" Not in a friendly, getting to know you way. More like he was already disappointed and just wanted confirmation. When I told him I was still working my way up in my career, his expression barely changed. Just a slow nod, like he had already decided I wasn't good enough for mom. She didn't say much, just gave my girlfriend that look, the kind that says, "You can do better." I knew right then they didn't like me, but I had no idea just how far they'd take it. When we got engaged, I figured her parents would come around. Maybe they just needed time to warm up to me. Maybe they'd see how much I loved their daughter and realize that money didn't define a person. Yeah? No. Instead of being happy for us, they doubled down. Every time my fiancée mentioned the wedding, it turned into a fight. Her dad kept asking if she was sure about marrying someone without financial stability. Her mom acted like she was making some massive mistake. They even tried to convince her to put things on hold until I got my life together. She didn't listen to them. She never once wavered. But the tension got worse, to the point where she started dreading any conversation with them. And when the wedding day came, they didn't show up. Not a call, not a text, nothing. Her grandfather walked her down the aisle instead. And I'll tell you this, she didn't shed a single tear over their absence. I should have seen it coming from the start. The first time I went to her parents' house, I thought it was just going to be a normal meet the family kind of dinner. You know, some awkward small talk, a few forced laughs, and maybe her dad throwing in a couple of classic "don't hurt my daughter" lines. Nope. From the second I sat down, it was an interrogation. Her dad didn't even try to hide it. He started grilling me about my job, my savings, my plans for the future. When I told him I was still working my way up, he just scoffed. Literally. A full-on scoff, followed by, "So you expect my daughter to struggle with you?" Her mom just sat there, sipping her wine like she had already written me off my girlfriend. Now my wife, shut it down quick. She told them I made her happy, that my financial situation wasn't their business, and that she wasn't looking for a rich husband. She was looking for me. Didn't matter. By the time we left, I knew exactly where I stood with them, and it only got worse from there. After that first dinner, it became clear that my fiancé's parents weren't going to warm up to me. If anything, their resentment grew stronger. Every phone call or visit turned into a passive-aggressive interrogation about my job, my savings, or my ability to provide for her. At first, they masked their disapproval with concern, making it seem like they were just looking out for their daughter. But over time, their criticism became more direct. Her father constantly brought up men from her past, former classmates, family friends, or acquaintances who had already achieved financial stability. He compared me to them, listing their successes as if they were the standard I had failed to meet. He made it clear that he didn't see me as someone who could give his daughter the life she deserved. Her mother, on the other hand, took a quieter but equally hurtful approach. She never openly insulted me, but her disappointment was obvious. Every conversation with my fiancé ended with warnings about making a mistake or rushing into something that would ruin her future. Over time, their concerns turned into fights. My fiancé defended our relationship at every turn, refusing to let their words influence her. But the more she stood her ground, the more hostile they became. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about control. They believed she was being reckless, that she was setting herself up for hardship, and that she wasn't thinking clearly. They told her to reconsider, to wait, to give it more time until I had proven myself financially. Eventually, they issued an ultimatum. If she didn't delay the wedding, they wouldn't come. She refused on our wedding day. Their absence was undeniable. While every other seat in the front row was filled with smiling family members, theirs remained empty. They didn't call, they didn't send a message, and they made no attempt to acknowledge one of the biggest days of her life. It was her grandfather who walked her down the aisle instead, stepping in when her own parents chose not to. Despite everything, she didn't let it ruin the day. She refused to dwell on their absence, refused to let their decision take away from the happiness of the moment. It was a reminder that she had chosen to move forward without their approval, and she had no regrets. For the next 3 years. She had no contact with them. No birthdays, no holidays, no attempts to reconnect. They had made their stance clear, and she saw no reason to chase after people who had turned their backs on her. Then, out of nowhere, they showed up at our doorstep. For 3 years. My wife's parents were nothing but a distant memory. No calls, no texts, nothing. They had made their choice, and we had moved on. Life went on without them. During that time, things changed for us, a lot. My career took off, and we were finally in a place where money wasn't a constant worry. We weren't struggling before, but now we were comfortable. We bought a home, traveled, and built the life we had always wanted. And then, the biggest change of all, we had a baby. Becoming parents was everything to us. My wife embraced motherhood with everything she had, and I did the same. The long nights, the early mornings, the exhaustion. It was all worth it. Our son became our world, and we were surrounded by people who loved and supported us. Her grandfather, the man who had stepped in when her own father wouldn't, was the first to visit us in the hospital. My parents were thrilled, and our friends showed up for us in every way. The people who actually cared about us were there. Her parents never reached out. Not when we announced the pregnancy. Not when our son was born. Not once. Then, one evening, there was a knock on the door, and there they were. Her mother was holding a neatly wrapped gift. Her father stood beside her, looking stiff and uncomfortable, like he didn't want to be there. They both smiled, acting like nothing had ever happened, like they hadn't ignored their daughter for years. It was surreal. Without hesitation, my wife stepped forward, looked at them for less than a second, and closed the door right in their faces. He didn't say a word. She didn't need to, and just like that, the people who had abandoned her were gone again after she shut the door. My wife walked straight to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and stared at the counter in silence. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't even angry. Just quiet. I stood by the window for a few more seconds, watching as her parents lingered on the porch. Her mother held onto the gift like it was some kind of peace offering that could erase 3 years of silence. Her father looked frustrated, shaking his head like we were the ones being unreasonable. He muttered something under his breath, and then, just like that, they turned around and left. When I walked back to the kitchen, I could see the tension in my wife's shoulders. She was gripping the edge of the counter, jaw tight, deep in thought. I didn't say anything. I just sat down at the table and waited. For 3 years, they had been ghosts. No calls, no texts, not even a half-hearted holiday message. They hadn't been there for the engagement, the wedding, the pregnancy, or the birth of our son. They had made their choice loud and clear. But now, when everything in our lives had finally fallen into place, they wanted back in. And we both knew WHYIT wasn't regret. It wasn't love. It wasn't about wanting to mend the relationship. It was about status. When they had cut her off, they had done it from a place of superiority. They believed she was making a mistake, that she was throwing away her future by marrying someone who didn't meet their financial standards. In their minds, they were teaching her a lesson, one they expected her to come crawling back from, asking for forgiveness. But that never happened. Instead, our lives moved forward without them. My career took off, and we were no longer just getting by. We were thriving. We had a house in a nice neighborhood, a stable income, and most importantly, we were happy. And then, we had our son. That was probably the moment they realized they had lost. They had missed everything. Her wedding, her pregnancy, the birth of their grandson. And now, after years of silence, they were trying to walk back into her life like nothing had happened, but she wasn't going to let them rewrite history. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had spent years grieving their absence, wondering if they would ever change, hoping that maybe, one day they'd reach out for the right reasons. But the moment she opened that door and saw them standing there, she knew they weren't here because they missed her. They were here because they finally saw her life as something worthy of their attention, and that was something she would never forgive. So she shut the door, and she wasn't going to open it again. After her parents left that night, my wife didn't say a word about them. She went about her usual routine, taking care of our son, focusing on work, spending time with friends and family, the people who had actually been there for her. To anyone else, she seemed completely unfazed. But I knew better. I could see it in the way she carried herself. Not sadness, not regret, just anger. The kind of anger that settles deep. Not the kind that explodes in the moment but lingers under the surface. The kind that comes from betrayal. She had already grieved the loss of her parents once. She had gone through the pain of realizing they would rather cut her off than support her choices. She had spent years making peace with their absence, accepting that they weren't the kind of parents who would stand by her no matter what. And after all that, they had the audacity to show up out of nowhere, acting like nothing had happened. Like they were entitled to be part of her life again. A few days later, her mother tried to call. She didn't answer. Then came the texts. At first, they were polite. They wanted to talk. They missed her. They wanted to clear the air and move forward. She ignored them. The messages kept coming. Her mother sent long paragraphs about how they only wanted what was best for her, how they had just been worried about her future, how they regretted not coming to the wedding and wished they had handled things differently. Still, she didn't respond. Then, her father sent a message. Unlike her mother's, it was short and to the point. You're being childish. We are still your parents. That was the moment she snapped. For 3 years, they had ignored her. For 3 years, they hadn't once reached out, hadn't asked about her life, hadn't acknowledged our son. They had treated her like she didn't exist. And now that things were different, now that she had a stable life, a good home, and a family of her own, they suddenly wanted to claim their role as her parents again. She wasn't having it. She picked up her phone and, for the first time, responded. One simple message. No, you're not. Then she blocked them. Their response was predictable. They tried to go around the block. They sent emails. They reached out through distant relatives, trying to get someone, anyone, to convince her to talk to them. They even contacted an old childhood friend of hers, someone they hadn't spoken to in years, asking if she could mediate and help them reconnect, but it was too late. They had been given one chance to be in her life. One chance to be there for her, to support her, to show up when it mattered. They had thrown it away. There wasn't going to be a second on. She was done for good after she blocked them. Life moved on. There was no dramatic confrontation, no last-minute attempt to change her mind. They were gone, just as quickly as they had reappeared. And my wife? She didn't look back. She didn't talk about them. She didn't wonder if they try again. She didn't waste a second of her energy on what-ifs. For her, the decision had already been made years ago. Closing the door in their faces had just made it official. But other people had opinions. Her grandfather, who had been the one to walk her down the aisle, who had always supported her, said she had made the right call. He knew the full story. He knew what it had been like for her, how they had treated her, how they had abandoned her when she needed them most. He wasn't going to tell her to forgive them just because they had decided to show up now. But not everyone saw it that way. A few extended family members, cousins, aunts, people who had never been that close to her in the first place, started reaching out. They had heard what happened and thought she should reconsider. They said things like, "They're still your parents. Family is family. They made mistakes, but they're trying now." But my wife didn't care. Because that was the thing, they weren't trying. Trying would have meant reaching out before they found out about our success. Trying would have meant apologizing instead of acting like nothing had happened. Trying would have meant acknowledging what they had done, not just deciding it was time to move on because it suited them now. They weren't trying. They were opportunists. She told the people who pushed her to forgive them the same thing she had told her parents. No, she didn't owe them anything. Not a conversation. Not an explanation. Not a second chance. They had chosen to cut her out of their lives. They had made their decision, and she had accepted it. But they didn't get to walk back in just because it was convenient for them now. They didn't want her. They wanted the version of her life that they could be proud of. But they weren't part of it. And they never would be, though the door stayed closed.